Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a look at what I think is a great combination, and that is the Nikon D7200 along with the Nikkor 70 to 200mm f2.8 lens. Now I'm mostly a Nikon shooter, so this is the setup that I'm using, and I realize that other camera manufacturers have similar setups. Canon also has its own 70 to 200mm lens, which I understand is fantastic. So being that I'm a Nikon shooter, this is what we're going to take a look at. Now I also realize that the D7200 as of today, it's a little over 3 years old, but I believe that it's still relevant today in that it's capable of producing really outstanding image quality. And it's got enough resolution to do beautiful large wall portraits, great for wedding photography. Yes, there's now newer camera bodies that may be a little bit better, so this may be good for somebody that's on a little bit of a tight budget, where if you don't want to go ahead and spend a whole lot more money, say for a new D500, or if you want to save money instead of going into a full frame, this will be an ideal setup for you to at least consider, because many times photographers may need 2 or 3 extra camera bodies to get the job done. But anyway, let's take a look at, if you're looking at this image here, notice that the full image here was taken on a Nikon D750, which is actually a full frame camera. And if you look on the inside where the crop mark is, this is going to be the crop factor of 1.5. It's the field of view that you get when you're using an APS-C size sensor, which is a crop sensor camera body. So even though the D7200 is a crop sensor camera, and the Nikkor 70 to 200mm lens is made for full frame but works equally well on a crop sensor camera body. And it's also a great combination, because if you look at the field of view, your equivalency of 200mm on the zoom side of that lens is going to give you 300mm field of view. So that in itself, as far as telephoto goes, can be a benefit. Now I realize that there are certain benefits in using a full frame camera body, and most people, unless you're a professional, but even as a professional, believe me, you can get professional results using the newer crop sensor cameras. And I don't believe the comments that I read where somebody might say, no way, you gotta have a full frame camera to do a wedding. Or you can't get any background blur, or you get lousy bokeh from a crop sensor camera. Well, this is nonsense. This is totally bullshit. So enough about the technical aspects of this camera combination. Let's take a look at some images and see the reason that these great cameras and this great lens was manufactured to give you outstanding image quality. Although I do love using prime lenses, if I wouldn't have my 70 to 200mm for portraiture, I would want to use the 85mm 1.4 or even the f1.8 lens. This is really a fantastic lens. But since I have my 70 to 200mm f2.8 lens, I'm going to use that and take advantage of the situation where I can zoom. Like in this particular case here, I start out with the wide zoom at 70mm. And notice here that even at f4.5, because we're at 70mm, we have a little bit of background blur. If we were to zoom all the way in and get as close as we can, we're going to get a lot more blur in the background, if that's what you want. Because there's going to be times when, at least in my case, I want to show some of the background. And there's going to be times also where I just want to blur the background out completely, and I want to isolate the people. So here we're getting just a little bit of soft focus in the background, just so we can still make out that it's a beautiful pond scene. So as I ask them to stand up, and then I zoom in a little bit closer, but I keep the camera setting, the aperture, at f4.5 yet. And notice now we get some nice background blur even at f4.5. And why is that? Well, first of all, I'm zoomed all the way in now to 200 millimeters, and I'm considerably closer. I normally get as close as I can. So by zooming in full at 200 millimeter and coming in close, that's going to decrease my depth of field, which is going to give me more blur in the background. Here's another case of being set to 70 millimeter, again f4.5, and then we zoom in again to 200 millimeter, and I'm still at f4.5. I do want to point out, sometimes I do get a little bit nervous when I'm shooting families, especially large families, and I have people that may be in front of some or behind others. I want to make sure that I have enough of a depth of field so that I'm able to get the group as sharp as I can. So that's the reason sometimes for families I don't want to shoot all the way open at f2.8. If you look here in this particular case, the little boy was a little bit more forward. So what I normally do is I'll get them together as close as possible. I'll put them on the same plane as closely as possible so we get everyone in focus as best as we can. Now what happens if we open up a little bit more to say f3.2? Like in this particular case here, we have 3 people just about on the same plane. We have a little boy that's a little bit in front of the group, so I try to get him as close to the group as possible. And at 3.2 it works out pretty much that they're all in focus. So let's stick with f3.2 like you see on this first image here. And because I'm set at 120 millimeter focal length zoom, we're going to get a little bit more depth of field. So I'm able to get in a little bit more in focus of the ukulele and the young lady that you see here. And even if you look at this next image, which was set to f2.8, and the zoom was 155 millimeter, we still get beautiful background blur, but yet because I'm not zoomed all the way in, we're able to get a little bit more depth of field. So what happens if you get as close to the subject as you can and you zoom all the way in as far as you can? In this case, we're again at 200 millimeters zoomed all the way in, and the aperture is set to f2.8. So this is going to give us a very shallow depth of field. It's going to blur the background out to the maximum. You're going to see background blur. Sometimes you'll see it, if we focus on the eyes, that the ears will be out of focus. Sometimes even the tip of the nose is out of focus. And especially the back shoulder, as you can see here, even on the second image, same thing, but you can see that the hair and the ears are a little bit out of focus. And yet that's okay, because you may want to bring more attention to the eyes. In fact, you see that quite a bit in these old glamour shots from the maybe 30s and 40s, where these photographers would use large format, like an 8x10 view camera. And then many times you would see that the eyes are in focus and the nose and ears are even way out of focus. And that's because they have very shallow depth of field with the combination of the lens they were using and their aperture setting. And here of this young man, we're set to 125 millimeter zoom, and the aperture is f3.2. And even at that, though, we can see sharpness in the eyes, and then if you look at the back shoulder, it goes slightly soft. And with the cap and gown here, we're zoomed all the way again to 200 millimeter, and again at f3.2. We're getting very nice blur in the background. And as we focus on the eyes, you'll also notice that his hand is just slightly out of focus. And here we're photographing by a pull here, and we're set to 75 millimeter. At f4, we get just a little bit of blurriness, but enough to reveal the location of where we're photographing at. So now as we zoom into 116 millimeter, and we're at 3.2 now, we're getting more blur in the background. And then now we zoom all the way in at 200 millimeter, and at 3.2 now, we're getting a nice blur in the background, but yet we get enough sharpness that we see that her face is very sharp, and also the guitar is relatively sharp. But the background is softly out of focus, and that's what we like here. And something else that I realized about the Nikon D7200 is that when you crop considerably closer, the image still holds up. It's still very, very sharp. So as you can see in this particular image here, there's a lot of space on the bottom. So this image has a lot of room for cropping. And also, this image was underexposed quite a bit. Now, also want to mention that if you're looking to get maybe a little bit more grain in your images, because sometimes you may want to put grain in just to maybe enhance or to make the image more artsy. And by underexposing it, you can add a little bit of grain, because as you adjust your levels in your image editing software program, you're going to see the grain. Let's take a look as we crop a little bit closer like you see here. And the grain is actually complemented when you make this into a black and white. And as we zoom in a little bit closer, then you can see how as we focus on the eyes and the top of the hair is in focus, and the back of the hair starts to go out. And also towards the front where we have the camera, that is very, very soft, also because of our shallow depth of field. So here we're back to using the aperture of f2.8, and as we focus on the eye area, notice that the hair falling on her right shoulder, because of the shallow depth of field, starts to go out of focus, and it's more noticeable as we come in a little bit closer. And on this particular image here, which was also cropped a little bit, but we can still see that as the eyes are sharp and we start to go back into the shoulders and to the back of the hair, we can see how it starts to soften up there. So now you have an idea of the image quality that this type of combination is able to create. And as Inspector Harry Callahan once said, a good photographer knows his limitations. So understand what your settings are capable and what your equipment is capable of doing. I explained the different apertures and how they affect your image. So once you understand that and you have decent equipment, it doesn't have to be super expensive either, unless you want it to be. I mean, there's nothing wrong. I love the full frame. I love the new 850, and I love the Sonys and the Fuji. Oh, I mean, there's so many great cameras out there, but this is for those that want to maybe consider a budget camera body, because now, being that it's 3 years old, you can get it for a whole lot less than what a newer one used to cost. And also keep in mind that your lens is also the 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 lens, can also be used on a full frame. And I also want to emphasize the importance of putting your investment first into glass, into your lens, because that's going to be, it's going to last you longer. These camera bodies, they're going to come and go and they're going to wear out. So by investing in a good lens, that's going to be a much better investment. And even if you have to sell one of your bicycles or your motorcycles or your second home, or you have to take a job as a bartender, or just doing something that can help you get some extra money, so you can spend that little bit more extra money and getting a really superb lens. You won't regret it. It's an investment, and that's all I got to say about that. Thank you for watching, and wish you all the best.